Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar brought to you by the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. Today, we will be talking about the Law Center's new legal advocacy manual called No Barriers, a legal advocate's guide to ensuring compliance with the education program of the McKinney-Vento Act. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping rules. This webinar session will be recorded and will be made available online along with the manual. We will send a follow-up email with today's information. We'll also share contact information to get in touch with all of today's speakers at the end of this presentation. If you are having trouble hearing or seeing the slides during the webinar, please use the chat box to let us know. And as we go along, we will ask for your feedback to a few survey questions that you can answer right here within the webinar. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so please feel free to type in your questions, and the panelists will try to address them afterwards. So who are the guest speakers today, and what will they be talking about? Well, first you have me. My name is Michael Santos. I'm a staff attorney at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty here in Washington, D.C. I will be discussing the highlights of the manual and how you can effectively use this as an advocacy tool when working with homeless children and youth. We also have Khadijah Williams, a homeless advocate currently living in Washington, D.C. Khadijah will be our guest speaker today, who will provide us with a critical perspective on homeless youth access to education issues. She elevated the issue of homelessness after being profiled in the Los Angeles Times and as a guest on the Oprah Winfrey Show. We also have Amanda Schneider, a staff attorney with Children's Legal Alliance of Legal Services of Eastern Missouri in St. Louis. Amanda will be discussing a collaborative model of legal advocacy embraced at LSEM and specific policies that directly affect homeless children and youth in St. Louis. Then we have Maura McInerney, a senior staff attorney from the Education Law Center in Philadelphia. She has filed several cases under the McKinney-Vento Act and will talk about how to assert legal claims on behalf of students experiencing homelessness and strategies for obtaining systemic reforms. She will also address the legal status of children awaiting foster care placement under the law and special protections for unaccompanied homeless youth. And last but not least, we have Katara Jordan, a staff attorney with the Children and Youth Project at Columbia Legal Services in Washington State. Katara will be presenting on using data, legislative advocacy, and the media to build awareness, address, and prevent student homelessness. So now I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker, Khadijah Williams.
My name is Khadijah Williams. I am an intern at the Office of the Ombudsman for Public Education, where I've worked on over 100 cases helping to ensure that DC children have full access to their education. This work is personal to me because I encountered barriers to accessing my own education. By the time I graduated high school, I'd gone to 12 schools in 12 years, 5 elementary schools, 3 middle schools, and 4 high schools. The only grades I completed uninterrupted were 3rd, 4th, 11th, and 12th. My mom, who died in 2011 as a direct result of homelessness, saw the world through untreated schizophrenic eyes. This paranoia led to a need to run to motels, shelters, armories, bus stations, abandoned buildings, and outdoors. When we couldn't afford to live in our own place, which was unfortunately always the case, we were frequently doubled up with unscrupulous men who had their own ideas about girls and women's value to them. I can count the longest number I've been anywhere as a child on 2 fingers. I cannot, however, count the number of times I've moved or the number of places I've been to. I didn't know that by McKinney-Vento's standards I was homeless, or that by the Department of Housing and Urban Development's definition, we were chronically homeless. But I did know that an education was my one and only chance. I didn't know what McKinney-Vento was until I was 20, because no one felt the need to tell me, but I benefited from it occasionally. I remember getting free uniforms, new clothes, and bus tokens in elementary school. I remember being enrolled quickly most of the time when we didn't have any documentation. But I also remember it seeming normal to travel from Orange County to Los Angeles and back using my mom's welfare check to pay the bus fare to get to school. It also seemed normal to not know what grade I was supposed to be in, because schools almost never had my records. It seemed normal for teachers and counselors to doubt my capabilities because my record was so pockmarked. Teachers stated, "Your records don't show you are gifted, so we can't place you in honors classes." Or reason, "Try this easier class, and then we can place you in honors if you do well." By the time my intelligence was recognized, I was already off to the next place. Homelessness is about more than lacking a roof over your head. It means a lack of stability and safety, a lack of structure in which the most basic social, interpersonal, and interpersonal skills are learned day in and day out. One consequence of this for me has been an almost crippling lack of confidence. This still impacts me today, as sometimes I speak as though I know less than I actually do. Unfortunately, school, the one place my confidence could be nourished, was often the place where my confidence was crushed, mostly inadvertently, but with the same long-standing effects. Thankfully, I was able to succeed despite all I've gone through, and I was admitted to Harvard University and graduated in 2013 in 4 years. But it was not because my rights were protected. I certainly didn't know how to enforce federal law in a school as a child, even if I did know my rights. McKinney-Vento exists because it recognizes that homeless students face undue burden to their access to education. By law, all homeless students must be provided these rights. The law does not distinguish between students who are more pleasing to help or more deserving. Unfortunately, because McKinney-Vento is not known to or understood by all school staff, I had to establish, against all odds, that I was smart enough, likable enough, deserving enough to be helped. I benefited enormously from countless mentors, nonprofit programs, and programs specifically for college-bound individuals. But most of this help came outside of school and was disconnected from the reality I faced in school. By teachers and outsiders, I was seen as smart and nice, a respectable black girl. Therefore, I was a worthy homeless youth. I don't want to portray my schools as the bad guys, since individual staff did support me and were, perhaps, acting in the spirit of McKinney-Vento, even if they didn't realize it. Unfortunately, schools lack resources, support, and training. Lacking these, schools focus on students like me who can establish themselves as promising. Other students will not be as lucky as I was. For every one of me that succeeds and has voluntary supports to fill in legal enforcement gaps, there are dozens, hundreds, even thousands who do not. I have told you all of this to show how I, despite all of the unusual support I've received, face numerous barriers to my education, and thus communicate how sorely needed you all are, every last one of you. Without you, the odds are stacked against these children as they were for me. Without you, another child will have to fight back alone against assumptions of uninformed and untrained school officials. Without you, another child will not know about the options available to them. No child should have to prove their worth to get support, as I did, because they are legally entitled to it. And McKinney-Vento is designed to prevent that. Homeless children are too busy trying to survive to the next day to try to figure out how their rights are being ignored, and they shouldn't have to. You are needed to ensure that schools have access to children's records to provide better individualized support. You are needed to ensure that no homeless child has to beg bus drivers to get on the bus for free to get to school. You are needed to ensure that the unsympathetic homeless children who've been kicked too many times to care anymore are not pushed out of school or pushed into the criminal justice system. You are needed to ensure that all homeless children know their rights. You are here to be their voice. Almost 30 years ago, advocates just like you secured the passage of the McKinney-Vento Act. Without advocates like you, even these rights would not exist. Now, you are needed again to ensure that the spirit and the letter of the law are upheld today. Thank you all for your work to ensure that children have full access to their education.
Thank you so much, Khadijah, for sharing your experience and providing personal context for what we will be talking about today. We are experiencing some visual delays, so I apologize for that, but you should be able to see the slides as they come along. So before we get down to business, I want to do a quick poll. In just a moment, you should see a survey pop up on your screen. Prior to this webinar, how familiar were you with Title VII of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act? So I'll give you a few seconds to fill that in. The choices are very familiar, somewhat unfamiliar, or very unfamiliar. We'll give it a couple more seconds until everyone's had a chance to participate, and then we'll close the poll in just a few seconds. All right, we're going to close it. So according to this poll, 36% of you are very familiar, 40% are somewhat familiar, 6% somewhat unfamiliar, and 18% very unfamiliar. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, I hope you find this webinar useful. For those already familiar, I hope the information we discussed today will complement your existing knowledge of McKinney-Vento. So before we even go further, I want to make sure that we are all on the same page. I'll be talking about some background information about our today's topic. Homelessness can be precipitated by any number of events: a lost job, a health crisis, or a natural disaster. But what's one of the challenges? Most Americans think of homelessness as a term that only applies to those unsheltered individuals living on the streets. But that is completely wrong. Homelessness includes individuals living with extended families and those living in hotels and motels, among other living arrangements. The first thing to understand about homelessness is that it's mostly a temporary phenomenon. It can happen once, or it can occur in multiple episodes, depending on the individual situation. Homelessness does not have a particular face. It is not an identity, but rather an experience. The experience of being displaced. Anybody can experience homelessness. You can be a professional with a graduate degree or be a part of the middle class and still end up experiencing homelessness at some point in your life. Homelessness is an ongoing crisis that continues to displace and negatively impact the lives of millions of Americans each year, with particularly negative consequences for children and young people. So why is child homelessness an issue? Well, in 2010, 1.6 million, or 1 in every 45 children and youth, were found to be homeless. In 2013, this statistic increased to 2.5 million, or 1 in every 30. To give you a bit more perspective, here's something to think about the statistic. If the number of homeless children and youth were a state, it will be the 36th largest state by population. If this number were a U.S. city, it will be the 4th largest city, just after New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. The number of homeless children and youth continues to increase every year, and without systematic long-term solutions to this problem, this alarming trend is unlikely to reverse anytime soon. Staying in school offers homeless children and youth educational continuity, stability, and a path towards academic and lifetime achievement. Irreparable harm results when students' education gets interrupted. Homeless children who frequently enter schools are more likely to have poor attendance than other homeless students who remain in stable school placement, and they are more likely to repeat a grade. Providing homeless students much-needed services and support is of critical importance at a time when they are experiencing great instability in their lives. Homelessness and poverty is not rocket science. While solving them may not be as easy, solutions are available. Here at the Law Center, we believe that affordable housing is key to ending homelessness. So let's get a bit more technical here, and I apologize in advance to those listeners who are wondering why we have butterflies in the background. But what I wanted to convey here is the life cycle of some sort. Anyway, I digress. The cycle will become clear in a minute. So, if you have a child, and that child gets education, then that student will be successful in school, hence making her competitive in the job market. Having a job provides stability, but what happens when you have barriers in every step of the way? It makes it harder for an individual to escape the cycle of poverty. And as you can see, obtaining a quality education is a vital step to breaking the cycle of extreme poverty and homelessness. So how do we ensure that homeless children and youth have access to education? Well, the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program under Title 7B of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, also known as McKinney-Vento or the Act, ensures that quality education is accessible by guaranteeing children and youth without a fixed, adequate nighttime residence, their right to remain in school, in their school of origin, and the right to receive free transportation to and from the same school even if they move. There are additional rights which we'll get to in a minute. Despite these requirements, many schools fail to comply with the law, either through ignorance or active efforts to avoid their legal obligations. That's why we have no barriers. So for those of you who have not had a chance to look at the manual, you're probably wondering what's in it. Here are the main sections you'll find in this resource. First, there's a section outlining the education rights of children and youth experiencing homelessness and the important roles of state and local actors in protecting those rights. There's also a section listing other education-related laws and how such laws can benefit homeless children and youth. There's a section that expands the list of homeless children and youth protected by McKinney-Vento and flags important issues you should know when working with these children and youth. There's also a section summarizing the problems in implementing and complying with McKinney-Vento. It provides factual excerpts from various cases to highlight how schools have not complied with the federal law and lists some issues to guide legal advocates in ensuring compliance. There's also a compliance section which shares compliance tools and resources as gathered by the Law Center. Second to the last, there's a section highlighting the lessons learned from litigation. This section includes summaries of cases where certain provisions of McKinney-Vento have been successfully enforced in court. Finally, there is a section that provides, among other things, sample advocacy documents such as advocacy letters and sample pleadings to inform advocates when assisting a family or youth experiencing homelessness. So if you're looking to file a preliminary injunction, there is a sample pleading you can reference. I will not discuss the last three sections here because most of these will be addressed by our other panelists. So why do we need this panel? Well, homeless children and youth too often have to overcome numerous barriers to enrolling, attending, participating, and staying in school. As I had previously mentioned, continuous access to school can lead to success and disrupt the cycle of homelessness and poverty. In addition to these barriers, many homeless children are unaware of their rights, and those who know may have limited access to legal resources to help enforce them. There is a great need for legal representation and legal advocates working in homeless youth access to education. This manual enables more advocates to break the cycle and address the gap in provision of legal services to homeless children and youth with educational needs. Today, we will briefly talk about the key concepts and provisions of McKinney-Vento. So who is covered by McKinney-Vento? Well, any child or youth who is experiencing homelessness. This includes, but is not limited to, an unaccompanied youth or a youth who is experiencing homelessness and who is not in physical custody of a parent or guardian. Homeless children also include children or youth who are awaiting foster care placement. McKinney-Vento also covers LGBTQ youth. Homeless children and youth identifying as LGBTQ face additional educational barriers not only because they are experiencing homelessness, but also because of their LGBTQ identity. It is important to note that they are an overrepresented and vulnerable homeless subpopulation, particularly within the group of unaccompanied homeless youth. McKinney-Vento also covers immigrant children, ELLs or English language learners, and LEPs. As some of you may already know, McKinney-Vento applies equally to immigrant children and youth who are determined to be homeless under the Act, regardless of their immigration status. Children of domestic violence survivors may also be covered. Domestic violence is a leading cause of family homelessness. Proper coordination and integration of links between domestic violence, education, and homelessness remains to be seen in policy and practice. McKinney-Vento also applies to children or youth who have temporarily lost housing as a result of a disaster. Most recently, we saw this issue come up right after Hurricane Sandy displaced families. Before we move on, I have a note about minority children and youth. Homelessness disproportionately impacts people of color, particularly African Americans. The same is true for each of the subgroups just mentioned, like LGBTQ youth. It is important for you to remember how racial bias can increase the challenges faced by homeless families, children, and youth of color. So now it's time to get into the nitty-gritty details. What is the definition of homeless? Under McKinney-Vento, a person is considered experiencing homelessness when they lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. To better inform this definition, McKinney-Vento specifically states that for homeless children and youth, homelessness includes situations where a child or youth is living doubled up or with a friend, relative, or other person because they lost their home or due to other financial problems, staying in a motel, hotel, trailer park, or campground because they have nowhere else to go, living in a shelter including emergency or transitional shelters, domestic violence shelters, and runaway and homeless youth shelters, staying in substandard housing, living in places not ordinarily used for sleeping, including cars, parks, public places, abandoned buildings, or bus or train stations, awaiting foster care placement, or abandoned in a hospital. So what rights are available? McKinney-Vento gives children and youth experiencing homelessness the right to remain in the school of origin even if they move. The school of origin is either the school that the student last attended when permanently housed or the school in which the student was last enrolled. The right to enroll in any public school where other non-homeless students living in the same attendance area are eligible to attend. The right to immediately enroll in a new school without typically required records such as proof of residency, academic records, birth certificate, immunizations, and medical records, and other papers. The right to participate fully in school activities. The right to receive transportation to and from school-related activities. The right to receive related school services that they may need. And the right to dispute decisions made by schools and school districts. So, which school can homeless students attend? McKinney-Vento requires school placement decisions to be made according to the child's best interest. This determination is fact-specific and must be an individualized assessment. The law assumes that attending the school of origin is in the best interest of the child, unless this is contrary to the wishes of the child's parent or guardian. Other feasibility factors, like for example, distance of commute, safety concerns, age of the child, special needs, may lead to a decision that the child's best interests are served by attending a new school. The school's decision must be put in writing and should include information about a right to appeal the decision. So, to what extent can students experiencing homelessness participate in school? As mentioned before, homeless students have a right to be immediately enrolled without required records. Enroll means permitting the student to attend classes and participate fully in school activities. McKinney-Vento does not define school activities, but it includes field trips and other extracurricular activities at school. Participation in sports are covered as well. These activities actually help keep students engaged in school. And given the law's requirement to remove policies that act as barriers, schools may need to provide fee waivers to facilitate access to some school programs. How can students experiencing homelessness get to school? There are 3 ways transportation can be obtained to help a student experiencing homelessness to school, any of which should be available as an option. First, for students attending their school of origin, school districts must provide or arrange transportation for students to and from their schools of origin upon request of the students or their parents. This requirement applies even when a student moves to a different city, county, or school district and must cross attendance zones or school district lines. Homeless liaisons must help set up the transportation, and I'll explain more about homeless liaisons in the next slide. Second, for homeless students who have enrolled in a new district, they must receive transportation services that are comparable to those offered to non-homeless students in the schools they attend. And third, Districts are also subject to an overarching obligation to remove barriers to the enrollment and retention of homeless students, which may require them to go above and beyond what is provided to permanently housed students. So who needs to implement and comply with the law? Very important question. Under McKinney-Vento, the U.S. Department of Education is authorized to provide grants to state educational agencies, or SEAs, to ensure that homeless children and youth have access to education. Each SEA is required to have a state coordinator. State coordinators basically have obligations under the law and are primarily responsible for ensuring that school districts follow the law. The law also requires each district to have a liaison or homeless liaison in charge of making sure homeless students can enroll and succeed in school. Part of their responsibility is to identify homeless children in need of services. Families, children, and youth can call their school district central office or visit their website to get their liaison's contact information. So before we talk about the right to dispute decisions, what decisions can be appealed? Under McKinney-Vento, parents, children, and youth experiencing homelessness have the right to appeal an adverse determination of the school or school district. In practice, decisions about school choice, school enrollment and participation, fee waivers, guardianship requirements, and transportation are the most commonly appealed issues. But other barriers can be appealed as well. You're probably asking, how can unfavorable decisions be appealed? Each state is required to have a process in place for prompt resolution of disputes. If there is a dispute about enrollment, the child must be immediately enrolled in the school in which enrollment is held until a full and final resolution of that dispute. This requirement is commonly referred to as the pendency requirement under McKinney-Vento. When working with children and families experiencing homelessness, always consider federal, state, and local laws that may provide you with additional tools to help protect the rights of your client. Here are some education-related federal laws to consider, which are also available in the manual. First, you have FERPA. FERPA prohibits the improper disclosure of personally identifiable information from education records. Parents have the right to inspect and review the education records of their children. Certain individuals must obtain parental permission prior to sharing information to a third party. So if you're a school official, for example, and you're thinking about sharing the student's information, think twice. FERPA. Head Start relates to preschoolers. A couple of things to say about Head Start. Children experiencing homelessness are automatically eligible for Head Start services. Head Start agencies must prioritize homeless children for immediate enrollment. School districts need to provide comparable transportation services to homeless children. You also have IDEA. Children with disabilities who are homeless have the same right to a free and appropriate public education as non-homeless children with disabilities. Similar to McKinney-Vento, Foster Connections allows children and youth in foster care to remain in their school of origin when it is in their best interest. Alternatively, if a move is needed, the state or school needs to provide immediate and appropriate new enrollment. The Child Nutrition Act provides homeless children and youth with free and reduced price school meals. Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also known as the No Child Left Behind Act, includes several provisions to ensure that homeless students benefit from its programs and services. The law requires schools to reserve or set aside funds so that homeless children and youth receive services even when attending schools that do not receive Title I funding. There are also important considerations under VAWA. Domestic violence is the leading cause of family homelessness nationally. Once survivors and their children lose housing, children's rights under McKinney-Vento are implicated. Other federal non-discrimination laws may be available to protect the civil rights of homeless children and youth. Homelessness disproportionately impacts children and youth of color, children and youth who identify as LGBTQ, and children and youth with disabilities. Homeless children and youth of color with disabilities and those who identify as LGBTQ may experience discrimination and barriers to enrolling, attending, and succeeding in school at levels significantly higher than other children and youth experiencing homelessness. Finally, there are also state laws and regulations that you should consider. State laws implementing McKinney-Vento vary greatly in scope and level of protection for homeless children and youth. So after I talked about the basics of McKinney-Vento, I just want to quickly talk about the challenges ahead. First, inconsistent application and reading of the law at state and local levels are systemic. Some school staff lack awareness about interfacing with homeless students and families. Many states and schools have limited staff and resources to provide technical assistance and necessary services. And another thing to note is that special transportation arrangements can be very expensive. Second, there are capacity strains at federal, state, and local levels to enforce McKinney-Vento. And like I said before, children and youth experiencing homelessness have limited access to counsel and other legal resources to help enforce their rights. In addition to implementation and enforcement challenges, there are laws criminalizing homeless youth that negatively impact youth's ability to access education. In effect, these laws create more barriers that McKinney-Vento is designed to eliminate. Failure of states to adequately implement and comply with the law have resulted in numerous lawsuits. These are just some of the common subjects of litigation. I won't read them out loud, but I will give you a few seconds to read through this section. Homeless students and their parents who sued sought monetary damages, temporary restraining orders, and injunctions to force school districts to follow the law and to revise policies to comply with McKinney-Vento. Some families filed a class action suit, others sued individually. And one thing to note is that these lawsuits can be very expensive and time-consuming. The manual also details the important themes for various cases, but I just want to highlight a few things. First, McKinney-Vento is a federal law, and it trumps any conflicting state law. Second, McKinney-Vento is privately enforceable under Section 1983. What this means is that parents and homeless children and youth can bring a lawsuit to enforce the provisions of McKinney-Vento. The Law Center was actually instrumental in making this happen. You can read more about it in the case called Lampkin versus District of Columbia, which is available in the manual. Third, there's no time limit on homelessness. It can last for more than a school year, depending on the child's situation. Some schools argue that just because the child has had the same living situation for a long time, that situation has become permanent. Finally, the cause of homelessness is irrelevant. Under the plain language of the law, the cause of a child's homelessness is irrelevant in evaluating whether the child falls under the law's definition of homeless. So we're at the end of my presentation, but I just want to give you a flavor of how these problems manifest in case law. Take CH versus New York, for example. More details about this case are available in the manual. But to summarize, this was a case filed in New York in 2011. CH had 2 kids. The kids were living with the mother when the mother lost her home due to foreclosure proceedings in 2010. They lived in a shelter but was later discharged. CH then took in the kids to live with their aunt outside the school district. So how did the school address the problem? Well, first, the children were disenrolled. Second, the school district met with CH and CH's sister and advised them that McKinney-Vento will be of no aid to CH or his children. Third, the school district failed to refer CH to a homeless liaison and advised CH that an appeal will be unsuccessful and therefore a waste of time. And last but not least, when CH arrived at the school a few days later to speak to school officials, cops were called to refuse to permit CH entry. The school officials conducted a meeting with CH outside the school, on the street, in public. So for our listeners out there, especially the parents, let that sink in for a moment and think how mortifying and undignified you would have felt if you were in CH's shoes. So that's pretty much a quick overview of the manual, and I'm going to turn it over to Amanda Schneider for a talk about her work at the Legal Services of Eastern Missouri.
Thank you, Michael. Let me make sure, let's see, I'll wait for my slides, I guess. There we go. So, good afternoon. My name is Amanda Schneider, and I have been a staff attorney at Legal Services of Eastern Missouri in St. Louis for a little over 9 years now. And I included my contact information on the first slide because I will have to exit the webinar before the actual end time, so I may not be able to answer any questions today, but feel free to follow up with me via email or phone there. Next slide. So just a little bit about the organization that I work for. So we're located in St. Louis, Missouri. We are an LSC-funded organization, and we provide free civil legal assistance to low-income individuals in 21 counties of eastern Missouri. My unit is the Children's Legal Alliance, and it focuses on all education law matters, such as school enrollments, school discipline, special education, and in general, I see our mission as really working to keep kids in school, keep them receiving a meaningful education and help them to graduate and go on to have successful post-secondary experiences. In my position, I thought it would be helpful to note is actually funded by a local law firm, Thompson Coburn. Next slide. And I've been asked today to speak about the model of advocacy that we utilize here at my organization. So in general, our organization takes a holistic approach to serving our clients. So holistic meaning through both informal and formal needs assessments, we attempt to identify and address other needs of our clients, not just the legal issues, but other social work needs, such as housing needs, mental health needs, educational needs, and then we attempt to link our clients with resources, opportunities, and services to meet those needs. So as a result of this approach, our organization employs social workers to work with lawyers. And Jennifer Hegeman, who could not join us today, is our Director of Social Work. She and I work together on a particular initiative that I'm going to speak about today, which focuses on homeless school enrollment cases. And we base that work on a community lawyering model. And there are varying definitions of community lawyering. So I thought I would include a definition that most clearly mirrors the model that we are embracing here. The goal of our approach here is to collaborate with the community to identify and address community issues with the goal of empowering communities, promoting economic and social justice, and fostering systemic change. So most importantly, the focus is on building and sustaining relationships within the community. Next slide. So our Director of Social Work, Jennifer, and I co-chair quarterly meetings that we hold out in the community at a local school district location. They actually host us for free. We hold quarterly meetings for homeless coordinators and service providers in the St. Louis metropolitan region to come together to not only provide training and resources, but to allow networking amongst all of the members. So the hope is to help identify legal issues and barriers that folks really out there on the front lines are seeing, to really, in the end, help our clients, the children and families that we work with in trying to get into school and to access their McKinney-Vento rights. One thing we do at the beginning of every school year is we provide an overview, McKinney-Vento 101 training. Many of you who may already do this work probably experience really high turnover of homeless coordinators. That's what we see here in the local region. So it's really important that there is at least at one point throughout our meetings throughout the school year that we at least do an overview McKinney-Vento 101 training. And just in general, what we see is a need for more training. And I think Michael alluded to this, is that these homeless coordinators are not being trained by the school districts. And for many of them, the only training that they receive is at our meetings. So I think that's important to consider in your own communities. What we also do is invite the state homeless coordinator to participate in the meetings. She's not always able to attend in person. She's in Jefferson City, which is a couple of hours away from St. Louis, and sometimes her travel is restricted due to budgetary concerns, but we always make sure she can participate in some way, so we have her even call in if necessary. And she is able to give an update on issues she's seeing and hearing about, as well as any state legislative updates, as well as grant updates if there are any new grant opportunities or what the status is of the grant opportunities that school districts should know about. Importantly, we also include service providers in these meetings. So we include shelter providers, we include transportation providers like cab drivers, respite providers, street outreach workers. We also include really anyone that touches on that homelessness population is really welcome to attend. And this allows us again to dialogue about the issues that they are seeing. And this also, the goal is really to facilitate improved communication between the shelter providers, for example, who often are making referrals to respective school districts, and to try to continue that dialogue and initiate better communication. Because communication is an issue we often hear about, is that poor communication is going on between everyone involved with the enrollment of children into schools. And something that's very important to note is that we always reserve time for plenty of question and answer sessions. So we always invite folks also to not only be heard on their questions and concerns, but also to bring up ideas for future topics for training and ideas for future speakers to invite. Next slide. Jennifer, again, who is the Director of Social Work here, takes the lead role in conducting the meetings, and she's truly a seasoned veteran in this area. She's worked even longer on the McKinney-Vento issues than I have. She is very well trusted by the community in this area, and so as a result, after these meetings conclude, she often gets more calls than I do about questions about McKinney-Vento, as well as she'll be the one who will get a million referrals, and then she will pass them along to me if they need legal cases open. And just as a reminder for those who are new to the area, the types of cases that we take on, the issues that we see are a lot of what Michael already alluded to. When children are not being immediately enrolled in school, when they present as homeless to districts, when they're not being provided transportation to and from schools of origin, or when they're not being offered dispute resolution or are in the middle of dispute resolution. But these cases, when they come in, Jennifer and I, when necessary, will consult, and she will also be available to provide that intensive social work assistance when necessary. But what I think you'll experience if you would attend one of our meetings is she is really playing the role, and this has just happened naturally, just perhaps because she is a social worker and I am a lawyer, but she has really taken on a good cop role and I'm sort of bad cop. So if she's there to really help get the conversations going, and if we do have questions specific to the law, I'm there to at least give my perspective on what I believe the law requires, if that makes sense. So next slide. So my role again is I'm there. I'm usually a little bit more behind the scenes, but I'm there to present on relevant topics in the law, especially when there are updates. If there are legal issues in our own community, like we've had an issue with this understanding of when is transportation to and from the school origin required, and really understanding that it is a mandatory obligation. That was one recent presentation that we did. I also, when necessary, update everyone on the status of federal legislation or state legislation as it relates to our children experiencing homelessness. And as I mentioned before, I take the lead on legal cases when they come into our office. And our approach is to, I'm sure like many, try to resolve them through direct advocacy first. And so what I think both Jennifer and I have experienced over time is that the relationship building that we have been able to nurture through these meetings has helped us to reach quicker resolution for our clients. So one other important aspect to the meetings is really taking that time for folks to understand what the real experiences of our clients are, and what poverty really looks like, what homelessness really looks like. And again, Michael alluded a little bit to, what the average layperson views as homelessness is not in reality what it may look like when it presents in front of these homeless coordinators. So we also spend a lot of time trying to really clear up any misperceptions and really inform the homeless coordinators and those who attend our meetings about, yes, what does homelessness really look like in practice. Next slide. And finally, I thought I would just include an example of one legal issue in particular that is ongoing in our local community, but something that we have started some work on, and we call it our under 80 issue with regard to transportation. But I thought I would explain a little bit about that issue in the context of how these meetings help us to really look at and be aware of systemic issues and start to really plan for how to address those issues. So in these meetings, we naturally grow to understand why school districts and their respective homeless coordinators are responding, to our clients and to children and families in the way that they are. And these meetings help us to foster not only an understanding of this, but an opportunity to strategize on how to resolve these issues if they are resulting in violations of McKinney-Vento. So one particular issue that we continue to work on is the issue of a state law not allowing a child to ride in a cab without a booster seat. I'm sure this is a common thing in other states as well, but so traditionally in our metropolitan area, though, children experiencing homelessness are cabbed. That's just the way it's always been. So when we recognized that the state was interpreting this it's a state regulation as requiring the child riding in a cab to also have that booster seat, we started out by inviting the state homeless coordinator and the state transportation director to provide training on this exact issue. So they came and they spoke about the law, but they also spoke about ways to address this concern and still be McKinney-Vento compliant. And so the meeting spurred so much discussion around the issue that a subgroup was formed at one point, a subgroup of, again, service providers and school district homeless coordinators to further discuss alternatives to cabbing. I mean, cabbing is already the most expensive probably way to transport children experiencing homelessness. So it led to really an expansion, a movement of sorts of school districts working together to develop a system of rerouting more school buses to transport instead of cabs. And then other common sense alternatives were also figured out because of this issue, this continued issue. So in some ways, this has resolved some of the issues that we were seeing around this issue of under 80, so children who are under 8 years old or under 80 pounds needing this booster seat. And it really started up dialogue around how are we going to resolve this issue. But we still do occasionally hear about situations in which no other alternatives are offered. And what results is the student is then forced to enroll in the school of residency. So we are still keeping an eye on this systemic issue locally, but I think it's very helpful to continue our work within the community to try to seek resolutions in the meantime while we're considering next steps with regard to litigation possibly. And that's where I'll end today. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. So now I'm going to turn you over to Maura McInerney for her talk about her work at the Education Law Center.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thanks very much for being able to participate today. So my name is Maura McInerney, and I'm a staff attorney at the Education Law Center. We're a statewide organization that advocates on behalf of educationally at-risk youth. So that includes children living in poverty, children with disabilities, children who are English language learners, children experiencing homelessness, youth in the juvenile justice system, foster care, etc. We do this through 3 strategies. We work through litigation. We also work to develop policy reforms and also work through legislative reform. We work in 3 areas, one being equal access to a quality public education, the second being ensuring adequate and equitable school funding, which we utilize both litigation strategies as well as legislative strategies to address. And the last is trying to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. So those are our 3 areas. So I became involved in this work in 2007 when I joined the Education Law Center. And I think I'm trying to make sure that the slide has information on it. Can someone? That's great. So I wanted to provide an overview of the common subjects of litigation. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, sort of lessons learned through litigation, and talk about some of the litigation that's been undertaken in the state of Pennsylvania and our involvement with that. So if you were to look nationally, you would see that the majority of cases involve the issue of enrolling children in school and ensuring that pendency during any dispute. So failure to enroll a child during a dispute is one of the common subjects of litigation. The second would be failure to provide transportation, although the McKinney-Vento Act is very explicit on that issue. and states that there should be either an agreement between the educating and sending school district as to who will cover the cost of transportation. If there's no agreement, those costs need to be split down the middle. Still, we will have children out of school waiting for that issue of transportation to be resolved, despite the clarity in the McKinney-Vento Act. Another area is really the failure to recognize a child experiencing homelessness. And you will see as I talk through some of the cases that we've handled, that issue seems to come up again and again. I see it very frequently with the issue of kids who are doubled up. If you were to look at different states, you'd see that some have as many as 70% who are doubled up, and that's the reason for homelessness. When we first started to become engaged in this work in 2007 in Pennsylvania, the vast majority of children recognized as homeless were actually children in shelters. There's been a significant shift in that, and now you will see that we have over 50% who are recognized as homeless who are actually doubled up, and that's commonly the most the largest proportion of kids who are experiencing homelessness fall into that category. You'll also see having an ineffective appeal process is an issue that you will see again and again in litigation that's been undertaken in New York and different places. Essentially, you have an appeal process that is not prompt enough or creates barriers to children's ensuring immediate enrollment. Essentially, it says you're not homeless, so you therefore have no right of appeal kind of a situation. So all of those issues being in place to ensure that the state education agency has complied with its obligations under the McKinney-Vento Act to have that effective appeal process in place is an issue. And you also see the sort of collateral issues resulting from children being out of school. For example, one of the cases that we litigated was on behalf of a child with disabilities. He was out of school for 6 months and ultimately was entitled to compensatory education services for every hour of every day that he was denied a free, appropriate public education. So that is a significant sort of collateral issue for children who are denied their rights under the McKinney-Vento Act. The other issue is in terms of monetary damages or fees that may be awarded by court. Next slide. So I wanted to start with the Lampkin case that Michael had referenced. The reason that this is significant is this is the first case in 1993, which clearly delineated the right of families to enforce their rights under the McKinney-Vento Act, recognizing that private right of action under the Act. And so I thought it was significant to start there and to highlight that issue. That particular case also resulted in many significant gains in the District of Columbia. It ensured the court ordered that children experiencing homelessness be identified and to refer them for services required by the law, including transportation, and actually set a timeline on that and said that within 72 hours of a family's application for emergency shelter, you had to provide tokens, ensure transportation, and it was very, very clear in terms of its directive. So you'll see the issues that were highlighted there where they were really considering the best interests in making school placement decisions, ensuring transportation, social services, et cetera, and comparable services, school meals. All of those were part of Lampkin. So significant systemic relief resulted from that case. Next slide. So first, a little information about Pennsylvania. During the 2013-14 school year, the Department of Education identified approximately 23,000 students experiencing homelessness in Pennsylvania. That is actually a 94% increase in students experiencing homelessness since the recession 2007-2008. So we've had a dramatic increase in terms of the number of children experiencing homelessness, which I know many states have experienced as well. We also have a different sort of structure with respect to the McKinney-Vento Act. We have a state coordinator, as all states do under the McKinney-Vento Act. We also have a series of regional site coordinators. So our 67 counties are divided into sort of different regions where we have a McKinney-Vento regional coordinator who is then over all of the school district local liaisons. So it's a slightly different structure. There's only one other state that has that structure. So I thought I'd give some examples from cases that we have handled here at the Education Law Center regarding children experiencing homelessness under the McKinney-Vento Act, because I think it gives you sort of a flavor of the fact pattern that comes up, the issues that courts need to address, and some of the sort of litigation strategies as well as remedies that were sought. So starting with AE versus Carlington School District. That was a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of 4 children who were sleeping in multiple school districts. They were actually part of an interfaith hospitality network. So as a result, they were actually sleeping in 5 different school districts. They would switch school districts each week. So they were staying in different places. This is a case that was brought against both the school district and the state, because essentially what happened is that none of those 5 school districts agreed to immediate enrollment of those children. So the children were left out on the street because each of the school districts said, well, I only have an obligation to immediately enroll the child who's living in my school district. These children are not. They're moving around all the time, so therefore they're not my responsibility. When this case came to the state level, the state said they also couldn't figure out who was responsible for educating the children. So we filed this case because we thought it was critically important for children, obviously, in this situation. It also greatly impacts families that are experiencing homelessness by living with different people who are doubled up, children, youth who might be, and families living in cars, people who are moving school districts all the time. And essentially, the result of that case was that all the children were immediately enrolled in the school district where they had initially sought enrollment, which is the place where they actually had a day shelter where the children went back and forth each day to receive their breakfast and then to be picked up, to be bused to whatever church they were going to stay in that week. And the state agreed to change its guidance and its policy on this issue and say that a child has a right to immediate enrollment any school district where they have a substantial connection, whatever that substantial connection may be. So we thought that that was important guidance that really remedied that situation and really resulted in a lot of more impact for other families and unaccompanied youth in these situations. The second case that's highlighted there, LR versus Steelton High Spire, was actually resulted in an evidentiary hearing on a motion for preliminary injunctive relief. That case is significant because it was filed on behalf of a child who had actually, this was the child who had been out of school for 6 months at that point. What had happened was he lived with his grandmother. When the house burnt to the ground in January, the school district recognized the child as homeless from January until June. When the child showed up for the school bus in September, the school district informed the grandmother with whom the child lived that he had no right to enrollment, to continued enrollment in the school, because now wherever they were living, doubled up in a nearby school district, was a matter of permanent residence. And therefore, he had no right to continue to be recognized as homeless under the McKinney-Vento Act. The order and opinion issued by the judge clearly states that there is no duration to homelessness and that the child continued to meet the definition of lacking a fixed nighttime residence, continued to live doubled up with another family who could throw him out at any time, and therefore he clearly had a right to immediate enrollment. In addition, under the pendency of McKinney-Vento Act, which states that if you're disputing enrollment, you must be immediately enrolled, the school district was directed to immediately enroll the child in school and that the child would remain there until the dispute was over. And a settlement of that case also resulted in significant compensatory education for that child because he was also denied a free appropriate public education during the time that he was out of school. The next case, NC versus Easton Area School District, was actually filed again against the school district and also against the state. in that case, the child was living on a campsite in a camper. The mother in that case happened to actually live and work for the school district. So the child had been recognized as homeless when the family first started to live in the camper after their house was foreclosed on and they had no resources and nowhere to go. The father had actually winterized a summer camper, and that's where they were living. And this was now 2 years later, and the school district said, well, you no longer qualify for under the McKinney-Vento Act, and they abruptly disenrolled in the middle of December a 12th grader as well as an 8th grader and said you have no right to continue to be in school anymore. So the issues and the state happened to agree with that determination as well and said, yeah, that's right, you no longer qualify because you are living in a place that could be permanent, and so therefore the camper should be recognized as being a permanent residence. So in that case, again, we brought a preliminary injunction motion. And the court agreed that the child had to be immediately enrolled, again, under the pendency provision, and ultimately the case was settled that the children would be able to remain in that school district, and that was their right under the McKinney-Vento Act. So that case was settled and again resulted in some change in guidance at the state level. The next case that was filed was actually just this past June, filed on behalf of a child who was awaiting foster care placement. And as many of you on the call know, every state has a different definition of what awaiting foster care placement means. In Pennsylvania, it's actually whether the child is awaiting a foster care placement, and so children and youth are essentially looking to identify a place where the child will live. It's a placement that essentially is intended to be maybe 30 days or less, but if it extends beyond the 30-day period, as long as children and youth say, yes, this child continues to be awaiting foster care placement, you still qualify as homeless under the McKinney-Vento Act. So that case was brought on behalf of a child who was actually placed in a quote-unquote shelter school. He was in a placement that is designated for children who are delinquent or dependent, so it's actually a secure facility. And he was given 3 hours of education at a shelter school and denied immediate enrollment in the school district. Again, in that case, the immediate preliminary injunction motion was resolved, and it was agreed that the child, in this case, we had proceeded and the child was actually removed from that setting. And the dependency court who knew about the lawsuit said, we'll just move him out of there. We have recently settled that case, and the school district had agreed to make up for the time that the 3 months that the child was in that shelter school, to provide essentially what would be compensatory education services for a child who has special education needs. In this case, the child did not, 8th grade student, honor roll, 13 years old, and to provide him, though, with some make-up services for the time that he was denied immediate enrollment in that school district. So I think that sort of gives you a flavor of some of the issues that come up, and to develop strategies with respect to both a local level change of policy that you might be looking for. In each instance, I sort of review what is the school district's policies with respect to the McKinney-Vento Act. For example, in that last case that I just cited, it resulted in a change in their policy that explicitly states that every child who is placed in that residential setting who is awaiting foster care placement has an immediate right to enrollment in the school district, and also that children who may be placed there who under our state law have a right to attend the public school may do so. So I think in terms of systemic relief, to ensure that with each case you're looking at the individual needs of the child, the impact of the denial of McKinney-Vento rights for the child, and looking for strategies that will address the issue for other children who will be in this situation, both at the local level and at the state level, with regard to how can we make the state policies more robust to ensure that there is relief, clarity in terms of what school districts should do, et cetera. Next slide. So I just wanted to highlight some other issues that might be on the horizon in terms of litigation. One of our concerns here that comes up a lot is sort of the rights of unaccompanied homeless youth. As many of you know, it's estimated that 1.6 to 1.7 million youth are experiencing homelessness while on their own each year. And remember that definition of unaccompanied homeless youth or youth experiencing homelessness while not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. These are exceptionally vulnerable children who often do not know what their rights would be under the McKinney-Vento Act. Unfortunately, with some school districts, there's an incentive to sort of counsel them away from being recognized as eligible under the Act. There may be concerns with regard to what is the background of this child? There may be prejudice, discrimination that takes hold. There may be concerns about how will this child test on our, how will this impact sort of our scores? All of those issues might come into play. And often these are youth who aren't aware of their rights. So my personal belief is that this is a population that often is under-identified. By way of example, in Philadelphia School District, very few children have been identified as unaccompanied youth. We have over 4,300 children who have been identified as experiencing homelessness within the school district, and yet only 45 were identified as unaccompanied youth last year, and that's 7 more than the year before. So we're concerned that this is a population that is very, very vulnerable. So I wanted to highlight a few things with regard to this population. One is the rights of LGBTQ youth who are disproportionately represented among unaccompanied youth. Fortunately, there are states who are looking at their state laws and trying to find ways to address the rights of those children, to clarify issues, ensure that children are not criminalized, etc. And there are really critical rights that they have under the McKinney-Vento Act that sometimes are not, highlighted. So one is that you have a proactive duty as a school district to gather the enrollment documents and to help unaccompanied youth to ensure that those documents are gathered after they are enrolled. Number 2, you must ensure that youth with disabilities have an active, involved decision maker. So you may have to appoint a surrogate parent under the Individuals with Education Disabilities Act for those children. It's an obligation that you have. And there are special rules that apply to ensure that initially who could be identified, to ensure that there's some active involved decision maker immediately under the IDEA. Third is to ensure that those children are accessing additional services that may be available under Title I, whether it's SAT prep testing, SAT fees, etc. And finally, ensure that youth who are graduating have documentation of homelessness status in order to qualify as independent under FAFSA. In order to access that critical financial aid, they need a verification form to be completed by a McKinney-Vento liaison, and there are other people who it can be as well, and they may need that documentation to be provided several times, and that's critical to their ability to access higher education. These children in the IDEA context, it often comes up, really need a robust transition services to ensure that they receive what they need. Another concern is that unaccompanied youth sometimes are in segregated settings. They may be in residential placements, they may be in shelter schools. All of those issues, of course, the McKinney-Vento Act expressly prohibits segregation based on homelessness status, and that's obviously an issue that came up in the CT case that I mentioned. But, that's something that you really need to consider in looking at unaccompanied homeless youth. The definition is clear and it's very, very broad. So to ensure that these children are identified and that school districts are undertaking proactive measures to inform unaccompanied youth of their rights, to make sure that posters are available in places that unaccompanied youth often are found, etc. So all of those issues are critically important, and we're really concerned about ensuring that we enforce the rights of those students. Next slide. So this is just my contact information. We certainly have a number of resources based on the complaints that we filed, changes we've made in state policy as well as local school district policy, and we're always happy to share any of those resources with you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Maura. I'm now going to turn it over to Katara Jordan from Columbia Legal Services. Katara, are you online? Katara, we can't hear you. Okay, while we're waiting for Katara, I'm actually going to skip over and do another poll. Okay, so before we end, here's another poll. As a result of this webinar, do you have a better understanding of the McKinney-Vento Act requirements? So we'll give you a couple of seconds to fill that in. It's just a yes or no question, so it should not take a long time.
Hi, Michael. This is Katara. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Katara, I can hear you. Perfect. So we're just going to finish. We're going to wrap up with this poll and then get back to you, if that's okay.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, we're going to close the poll. So according to this poll, 94% of you found you have a better understanding of the McKinney-Vento Act requirements, which is great news. And as I said before, we certainly hope that you find the information provided here and that we discussed today helpful in the work that you guys do. So I will turn it back to Katara Jordan from Columbia Legal Services.
So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Katara Jordan, and I'm a staff attorney with the Children and Youth Project at Columbia Legal Services. Columbia Legal Services is a civil legal aid organization in Washington State, and we advocate for people who face injustice and poverty. We seek to achieve social and economic justice for all using policy reform, litigation, and innovative partnerships to reveal and inactions that harm the communities we serve. Now, we are made up of 4 different project groups: the Institutions Project, the Working Families Project, the Basic Human Needs Project, and the group that I'm a part of, the Children and Youth Project. And the Children and Youth Project, we use community education, research, policy advocacy, and litigation on behalf of Washington's children, youth who are low income, who are at risk, who are homeless, or who are in foster care. And today I'm going to briefly talk about using data, legislative advocacy, and the media to build awareness and address and prevent student homelessness. Next slide, please. So because we're a civil legal aid organization, but we actually do not receive LSC funding. Most of our funding is from IALTA funds and often from private organizations. So that gives us the ability to use other advocacy tools such as lobbying our state legislators and serving populations that we wouldn't necessarily be able to serve using LSC funds, such as immigrant populations that have not obtained citizenship. So what you see here is kind of a puzzle piece of the strategy that we've used to kind of discuss student homelessness in our state, and I'm going to go through each strategy piece by piece. Next slide. So how did we start? So initially we received a grant from the Gates Foundation to kind of look at student homelessness to see how could we target students experiencing homelessness as a way to help target family homelessness as a whole. So what we did as part of the grant is we took a non-litigation strategy where we convened kind of the group in the McKinney-Vento Homeless County area in Washington State, which is 3 of the largest counties in our state, but they're located in Western Washington. So we convened homeless liaisons, service providers, and others to kind of get together to talk about this issue. And prior to our convening, these individuals had never met with each other. And so it was a way for us to kind of hear the concerns of the school district, hear the concerns of the service providers, and try to figure out a way that we can communicate better so we can collaborate on serving the homeless student population. As part of that, we also took a, outside of our Gates grant, we took more of a litigation strategy in the sense that we were looking at other districts across the state by sending public disclosure requests. And so part of the reason why we sent these public disclosure requests was to examine the policies of the school district, to see if they had their policies available on McKinney-Vento, to see how their homeless liaisons were interacting with students, to see what information they had on their website, was the information accessible to homeless students. And so what we did is, with the district kind of outside of the Gates grant, we examined their policies to see what was going on, but we also did that with the districts who were covered by our Gates grant, and we sent them public disclosure requests, but more out of a remedial approach, not necessarily a litigation strategy. And we did the same thing, and what we found is that, one, we knew that schools were under-identifying students, but most schools, as some of the previous presenters have mentioned, really didn't understand McKinney-Vento or understand the rights that students had under McKinney-Vento, and many, which is still true now, did not have a full-time liaison. So based on that, we kind of went through, as I mentioned before, went through their policies with a fine-tooth comb. We offered recommendations on how they can improve those policies to make sure that they were complying with McKinney-Vento. And, you know, we offered training as well. I think one of the presenters mentioned how they do a McKinney-Vento one-on-one training. We do that as well with King County, so individuals, you know, have an understanding of how McKinney-Vento works at the beginning of the school year. We also have a website called schoolhousewa.org that has a lot of our policy papers related to student homelessness and how we can, by targeting students who are experiencing homelessness, we can really come up with solutions towards improving affordable housing for families that are experiencing homelessness or housing instability. Can you please go to the next slide? So one of the things that we did was we analyzed student homelessness data. Now, as part of McKinney-Vento, every school district has to provide their state board of education with data on how many students that they identified in a particular school district. And so we took that data because although it's publicly available data, no one was really using the data really to talk about it except in very broad terms. And so what we did is, you know, we looked at the data over the years, and as you can see kind of on the top graph, it shows a huge increase in student homelessness from 2005, when our state really started tracking the numbers, until 2011, 2012. Currently, our numbers are at 32,494 homeless students. But why this is so powerful is that when we started broadcasting this number, people started to listen, saying, oh my gosh, we didn't realize that this problem had grown so much. And, you know, as the presenter from the Education Law Center mentioned, her state has had a 94% increase. Our state has had an increase as well in the 90 percentile, and we were able to show that these numbers keep increasing each year. As a state, we need to do something about it to serve these students. Also, we were able to get some education data on students who are experiencing homelessness. And one of the most powerful things we did with that data was it connected to student education outcomes. So when we go to our legislators, when we go to the media, when we go to other policy stakeholders, we can say, hey, these students, homeless students, are, falling 20 to 25% below math, reading, and science compared to their house peers. We can also, and I'll talk about this a little more when we get into the legislative advocacy, we now also have graduation rates for students experiencing homelessness, and the outcomes are pretty dire. And so based on having this information, we're able to kind of show evidence for why our state needs to do something to support these students. Next slide, please. And so based on analyzing that data, we started putting out position papers to educate the stakeholders on what's happening with this population. If you go to our website, schoolhouselaw.org, you'll see a lot of these papers that we've written, but we had a simple Venn diagram kind of explaining who are Washington's homeless children and youth. Oftentimes in our, advocacy communities or even outside those communities, we use homeless children and homeless youth interchangeably, or homeless students and homeless youth interchangeably, but oftentimes they overlap, and to some degree they are different populations experiencing different things. So just being able to set that out really help people understand the different populations, how do we target these populations, and what solutions need to be done. And a big part of what we do, particularly under kind of our GATES initiative, is we're trying to explore, although we think transportation is an extremely important right under McKinney-Vento, and it definitely should be used to continue to provide support school stability to students experiencing homelessness. We recognize the cost that transporting students to and from their school of origin can have on a school district. And so we've been trying to come up with creative ways. How do we keep a student in their school district without having to transport them, large distances because they can't find housing in their particular district? So we came up with a position paper on figuring out how could we use transportation dollars flexibly to provide housing for families, which would actually provide better outcomes for students. We did an informal survey of homeless liaisons in our state to kind of get a better idea of how many hours they're spending on providing services to homeless students. And we found, which also kind of aligns with a national study, that homeless liaisons often only have about 2 hours to 4 hours a week to dedicate towards serving homeless students, which is a huge issue if you have one homeless liaison per district and they have hundreds of students who are experiencing homelessness that they're responsible for. Next slide. And so one of the things that we found helpful is, one of the things I failed to mention earlier is that in our state we haven't had a lot of litigation towards this issue. And part of that reason is that we do have a great state coordinator who has worked very diligently with school districts to try to get them up to speed on McKinney-Vento. But as people have previously mentioned, there's such high turnover in these positions that sometimes it's hard to maintain that consistency, particularly if a school is not providing regular training to students experiencing homelessness. But I know that at our state level, we do provide 2 yearly trainings that are also attended by the policy director at NACY as well as the legal director at NACY, which is the National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth, and they provide a great training to homeless liaisons in our state. So that plays a big role in helping to ensure some consistency among school districts, but we still have a long way to go. But we've collaborated with the Housing Alliance, we collaborate with an organization known as the SCITCH, Seattle King County Coalition on Homelessness, the University of Washington School of Law, and Seattle University. Each of these organizations have helped us push or build awareness towards student homelessness, not only in the media, but also with policymakers. And if you see that brochure, it says Understanding Homeless Students' Educational Rights. That's actually a collaboration between the Seattle King County Coalition on Homelessness and us, and it comes out of our McKinney-Vento 101 presentation. And what it does is a basic brochure. It provides all the basic rights under McKinney-Vento, and if you turn it on the back, it has every homeless liaison listed in King County, and it's a huge resource for service providers, even to the point that some of the school districts use these handouts to hand out to the community so they know about McKinney-Vento. All right, next slide, please. And so advocacy. So doing this education, identifying students, collaborating with others actually helped us work on state policy level issues where in 2014 we were able to pass the first bill dedicated to homeless students and called the Homeless Children Education Act. And what that act does is that it requires each school district at the beginning of the school year to make sure that they are providing information about McKinney-Vento to families. So in the welcome packets that come, we want to make sure that families are seeing this information. It also requires our state to track data such as certain demographic data such as race, grade, educational attainment, those kind of things. So we kind of have a better idea of what's happening with these particular students. What's great about this particular legislation is that it also required that our the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, which is our equivalent of, I guess, the State Board of Education or the state agency, the state education agency, to provide a biannual report to the legislator on the status of homeless students. And because of this particular legislation, for the first time, we received information about homeless student graduation rates, which is information that is really hard to find because most people aren't tracking this information. And what we found was that homeless students have the second lowest graduation rate out of any group, with the exception of kids who are in foster care. And as we know, kids in foster care and kids who are facing housing instability often face some of the same challenges because they're moving from place to place. And, you know, I'm sure you guys have heard the data that each time a child moves, they fall 4 to 6 months behind. So it's really important that we figure out ways to keep kids in their school district. Ideally, help kids find homes in their school district to help kind of mitigate some of the challenges that come with experiencing homelessness. And one of the great things about, you know, this approach is that this year and last year, we introduced a bill called the Homeless Student Stability Act. And what that bill wants to do is increase funding to our state education agency to help them provide school districts with funding to help support their McKinney-Vento programs. As many of you know, most states are only providing what the federal government gives them. And our state receives anywhere between $950,000 and $1 million to spread over 295 school districts. Now, that money is spread through a competitive process, which means that only about 34 school districts are receiving funding, and that funding is anywhere between $30,000 to $45,000, which is a drop in the bucket when you're talking about serving homeless students, providing them with transportation, making sure you have a dedicated liaison on staff. And so what we're trying to do is say, hey, state, we can't just rely on the money that the federal government is providing. We also, as a state, need to put money up to make sure we're supporting these students and helping them improve their education outcomes. The other part of that bill will actually kind of create school housing partnerships in our state has been really innovative in thinking about ways to serve homeless students. And two of our housing authorities have partnered up with school districts to provide housing to families that the schools identify as homelessness. And so we want to build on those models and see if, they do have a huge impact on improving student outcomes. And so that's what we hope that this particular bill, it didn't pass last year, we're pushing it through this year, and we're really excited about our state taking an active role in providing funding for students. Next slide, please. And so that's just wrapping it up. If you have any questions about possibly how to get started on legislative advocacy, on media strategy, on how to frame this topic with legislators or other important policymakers, please feel free to contact me on my email address or by phone. Thank you so much for having me, and I really hope you guys have a great day.
Thank you very much, Katara. So we'll have time for Q&A in just a moment. I know we're going over time, but before we begin, we have one final survey question for you. So the question is, are you likely to use the information you learned today in your work? It's a yes or no question, so it should be relatively quickly. We'll give you a couple of seconds to fill that in, and then we'll close the survey in about 10 seconds. All right, we're going to go close it, and I'm going to share it with you guys. So 97% said that you are likely to use the information you learned today in your work. So that's great news. I do want to give out my information. So let me pull that slide up for you guys. So if you have any questions, any follow-up, feel free to email me. My contact information is on the slide. Just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted online next week. We will email a link to everyone, and we encourage you to share this with your colleagues or anyone who might find it helpful. So that's my contact information, and now we're going to open it up for a Q&A. And you should have all of the presenters' contact information available in this slide as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read out some of the questions that we received in the chat box, and I'm hoping that the panelists will be able to help me answer these questions. So the first question is, does the right to transportation include after-school activities such as clubs or sports? So the quick answer to that is yes, to the extent that the school is providing the activities. So like I mentioned before in my presentation, if it's a school-related activities, homeless students have the right to access those activities. Katara and Maura, I don't know if you've seen this in your states, but if you can comment on this, that will be great.
Oh, hi, this is Maura. Yes, I think, we have handled that through advocacy in individual cases to ensure that children are able to receive transportation following after-school activities, making the argument that they're entitled to comparable services, they can't be treated differently based on their homelessness status, et cetera.
Great. Okay, so moving on to the next question. How can you differentiate between a doubled-up situation temporarily or living with a family or friend for the longer term due to limited financial resources, e.g. a family that lost their apartment due to lack of funds and who is living with the mother or grandmother while trying to locate affordable housing? Do any of the panelists are interested in taking this question?
So this is Maura.
Yeah.
I would say that I really look at the legal status of that family. For example, could they be kicked out of that situation? Do they have a legal right to remain there? Is it a permanent situation for them? They're not on the lease. They're not on utilities. They don't have any right to remain there. So I look at those circumstances with respect to their legal status.
Okay, great. So another question is, if a family is living with other family members, pays a portion of the rent, and has kept this status for many years, yet has never been listed on the lease, are they still considered homeless? So I would just like to remind that for these cases, it's an individualized assessment, so you should look at these situations on a case-by-case basis. But given the facts of this case, at first glance, it doesn't look like the situation that is covered under McKinney-Vento. But if there are other facts showing that this is not a permanent housing situation for this family, then there can be an argument to be made that they should qualify as homeless. So I open it to the other panelists if they have any comments or if they would like to address this question as well.
So I would also say that you would look at, I agree with you that they probably would not qualify as homeless, that they do have a fixed adequate nighttime residence. I think you, again, need to look at the state law and see to what extent the payment of rent establishes a legal right.
That's a good point. Okay, one more question. I work in the College of Education. Could McKinney-Vento address a requirement for including McKinney-Vento as a requirement or learning standard in colleges of education in higher ed? This could be a way to ensure all educators are aware of the Act and its requirements. So we've seen this happen already, and this is in the context of financial aid. So recently, the Department of Education issued guidance clarifying how unaccompanied homeless youth can qualify for applying for financial aid under FAFSA without having to submit parental information. And you can find out more information on that through NACE, which Katara has referred before, and it's the National Association for the Education of Children and Homeless Youth. So to the other panelists, I don't know if you have anything else to add, but feel free to chime in.
Hi, Michael. This is Katara. I think I understood the question a little differently, but I could be wrong in regards to making sure that educators, particularly those who are in school being trained to get their degree in education, I think it could be really helpful to have training at that level as well. I know that in our state, when we were pushing the Homeless Children Education Act, there was a lot of pushback towards requiring mandatory training for all school staff on McKinney-Vento. And one of the alternatives was making sure that we address these issues for incoming teachers. And so I definitely heard it from the higher education perspective in terms of financial aid, but I think that there's other ways that we can discuss how to inform those who are going into schools. And I kind of heard the question kind of as a way of how do we address that as well. So I just wanted to put that in there.
Thank you, Katara. So I can read a couple more questions. So the second to the last question is, am I correctly understanding that every school or school district is required to have a homeless liaison? If so, must this be a full-time position? I'm thinking of the many small rural school districts in our state. I doubt many or even any has a full-time person doing this. Katara, would you like to take that question? I know you've alluded to it.
Sure. So you are correct that every school district must have a homeless liaison, but that there's no requirement under the law that that liaison needs to be full-time. We particularly understand with smaller districts that having a full-time liaison may not be necessary. But with some of the larger school districts, we have found that it is almost necessary to have a full-time liaison, if not more than one homeless liaison to adequately serve homeless students. And if I can just give an example of that, when we were initially starting our public disclosure request, we had a large school district that had a homeless liaison who was working also as a truancy officer. For reasons that I won't get into, that's a conflict in itself. But once the school districts prioritize having a full-time liaison. They went from identifying 800 homeless students to almost 1,900 homeless students that following year. So I just want to put in a plug that if we can have someone at large school districts who are full-time, that is extremely helpful towards serving this particular population. But no, the law does require that each school district have a liaison, but it does not require that that liaison be full-time.
Thanks, Katara. So I'm going to read the last question, and for those of you who still have additional questions, again, you have everyone's contact information on the slide in front of you, so you should be able to send us a follow-up email after this webinar. But the last question will be, does a child who moves into a housing, transitional or permanent, during the school year in the new district have the same rights to remain in the school of origin? So I can take this one. So under McKinney-Vento, if the child was experiencing homelessness at the beginning of the school year and then later finds permanent housing during the school year, that child is actually entitled to stay in the same school that he or she was enrolled in. In terms of transportation, so transportation only covers students who are experiencing homelessness. So once the child has found permanent housing, the school is not legally obligated to provide transportation to that child after they get permanently housed.
Can I just add something to that, Michael?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's federal guidance that strongly urges school districts to ensure school stability for children, including providing transportation costs. So I would also recommend that you look at that guidance as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to chime in, particularly with Title I funding, if you are experiencing a problem with schools providing transportation, you may be able to push back in terms of some informal advocacy on seeing if schools could actually use Title I funding to provide transportation for those students to continue out the school year and receive transportation to their school of origin.
And that guidance addresses that as well. That's a really important point.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So before I close, I do want to, for those of you lawyers who might be interested in providing legal assistance to homeless children, youth, and families, I would like to invite you to join the Law Center's Lawyers Education Access Resource Network, also known as Project Learn. And this network really serves as a peer-to-peer network of legal providers working on McKinney-Vento access to education issues. So if you're interested, please feel free to email me at my email address. And again, feel free to follow up after this webinar. One last thing is that the Law Center is conducting a short survey to assess the ability of legal service providers to address the needs of homeless students. The goal is to understand the need for providing legal services to homeless youth who encounter barriers in enrolling, staying, and participating in school, and to identify any concerns, gaps, or areas the Law Center can address. So the survey should take no more than 3 to 5 minutes to complete. The survey link will be included in the post-webinar follow-up email. And if there's no other issues, I'd like to conclude this webinar. Thank you all so much for participating today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.